Okay, let's unpack this. I have to admit, when I first saw the title of the source material we're covering today, I did a double take. It claims to present, and I quote, overwhelming evidence that God does not exist. Now, usually when you see a title like that, you expect a debate between a scientist and a theologian, or maybe, a breakdown of atheist philosophy, right?
Right. You expect the usual suspects.
Right.
Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, the arguments about evolution versus creationism or the Big Bang versus Genesis.
Exactly. But here is the twist, and it is a massive twist. This argument isn't coming from a militant atheist. It's coming from a source identified as the blind Muslim yogi. And the evidence he uses to argue that God doesn't exist, he pulls it directly from the definitions of God found in the major world religions themselves.
It is a fascinating intellectual flip, isn't it? It really forces you to check your assumptions at the door.
It really does.
And the source explicitly asks us right at the beginning to not get emotional. He wants us to approach this like a court case. He's asking us to look at the evidence objectively, almost like a lawyer presenting a brief, to see what the verdict is on the existence of God based on how these religions actually define the divine.
Which is wild because you'd think religions define themselves by the belief in a God. So the idea that you can use Islam or Hinduism to prove God doesn't exist feels completely counterintuitive.
It does, until you start digging into the specific words and logical frameworks he's using. The central tension here, the thing we really need to unpack, is the definition of existence itself.
The word itself.
Exactly. The source operates on a very strict logical framework. He looks at terms like conceivable, physical, and empirical. And his argument essentially boils down to this. If you describe something as strictly inconceivable, does that thing, for all practical and scientific purposes, actually exist?
That's a heavy philosophical question to start with. It reminds me of that old question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? But here, he's asking, if a God is so abstract that you can't conceive of him, is he even there?
Precisely. The source is essentially setting a trap using language. We use the word exist for things like tables, chairs, planets, things that have form and location. He's challenging us to see if the religious definition of God fits into that box of existence.
So let's get into this courtroom. The source sets this up as a trial. We have a question on the docket. Does God exist? And he calls several witnesses to the stand. Christianity, science, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
And he wants to reach a verdict based on the balance of probabilities.
Right.
So let's look at the first witness he brings up, or rather the baseline he establishes, science.
Right. This part felt the most familiar. The source says the scientific community requires empirical evidence.
Correct. Empirical evidence means something you can observe, measure, or test.
Yeah.
It's the picture it didn't happen standard of reality.
You're right.
The source argues that since there is no empirical evidence, no physical proof that you can put in a test tube or measure with a ruler that God exists, science effectively casts a no vote. From a strictly scientific standpoint, if it can't be proved to exist physically, the default position is that it does not.
Okay, so science votes no. That's one for the non-existence column. But then he brings up Christianity, and this is where I got confused. He positions Christianity as the only yes vote in this entire analysis.
It is a surprising distinction, isn't it? Usually people lump all religions together.
No.
But look at why he grants Christianity a yes. The source focuses on the Christian claim of the Trinity Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but specifically the claim that God walked on earth and was born.
He's talking about Jesus, obviously. The incarnation.
Right. The source notes that Christians say he is and he was born. They argue there is historical evidence, places where he walked, evidence that he really did exist as a figure in history. Because Christianity anchors the divine in a physical, historical person who really did exist, the source grants this as a claim of physical existence.
So because there's a claim that you can point to a time and place and say God was here physically in a body, Christianity gets to be the outlier. It votes yes.
Exactly. It satisfies the condition of empirical or physical existence, at least in its claim. But that's where the yes votes end. This is where the source pivots to Islam, and this is really the core of his logical argument. This is where it gets really interesting.
This is the part I really want to dig into. The source is the blind Muslim yogi, analyzing Islam. You would assume Islam is a yes vote. Muslims worship God Allah. They pray 5 times a day. But the source puts Islam in the God does not exist column. How does he justify that?
It all comes down to the definition of the divine in the Quran. The source highlights that in Islam, God was never born and does not give rise to birth. He has no parents, no children, no partners.
Yeah.
But the key word he latches onto is inconceivable.
Inconceivable.
He breaks that word down with brutal logic. He says if God is inconceivable, it means he is not something physical. He is not concrete. He isn't an entity sitting in a certain space that you can point to.
The transcript mentions this specific phrase that really stopped me in my tracks. Neither existence nor non-existence, and neither form nor formless.
That is the crucial philosophical concept. The source argues that if you have something that has no form, but isn't strictly formless, something that is completely beyond our ability to conceive or imagine, then how do you categorize that in a logical scientific framework?
He's saying that if you can't conceive of it, it's functionally the same as nothing.
Precisely. He asks, what does inconceivable mean? And his answer is not existing and not non-existing. He argues that if you look at this logically, philosophically, and scientifically, a description of not concrete, not physical, and not in space means does not exist.
Wow. So he's saying that while Muslims worship this entity, the description of the entity being beyond space, time, and form aligns with the definition of non-existence.
Yes. He says, don't get emotional. He's trying to strip away the act of worship and just look at the definition of the object of worship. If the Quran says God is everywhere and inconceivable and not an entity in a specific space, the source argues that logically this equates to non-existence. So Islam, in his court of law, provides evidence for the no column.
That is a massive leap of logic, but I see the thread he's pulling on. If I tell you I have a box and inside the box is something that has no shape, no weight, no color, and takes up no space, you'd tell me the box is empty.
Exactly. And the source is saying the Quran tells you the box is empty of physical things. It tells you God is not a thing. And if he isn't a thing, then scientifically, he doesn't exist.
It's mental gymnastics, but it's consistent. Okay, so science is a no. Islam, according to this logic, is a no. Then he moves to Hinduism, or Sanatana Dharma. And this is interesting because he distinguishes between different levels of the religion. It felt like he was peeling an onion.
This is a very nuanced part of the source's argument. He acknowledges that Hinduism has what he calls a lower level and a highest level.
The lower level is what we usually see, right? The statues, the stories, the many gods.
Yes, what he calls the Dvaita or duality aspect. He explains that this exists because regular people can't conceive of the highest truth.
Yeah.
The mind needs something to grasp. So you have names and forms. He specifically mentions Vishnu, Shakti, Shiva. The source views these as a starting point to elevate consciousness.
Like training wheels for the mind.
In a way, it's a way to engage with the divine when you aren't ready for the abstract reality. It's the user interface, not the code. But the source argues that we have to look at the highest conclusion of the faith, which is Advaita Vedanta.
Advaita means non-duality, right?
Correct. Non-dual. Becoming one with the one. And here, the source points out the exact same pattern we saw with Islam. At this highest level of Hindu philosophy, the divine is described as beyond form and formless.
He says not a he or a she.
Right. And again, inconceivable. The source argues that once you reach this peak of Hindu thought, you aren't worshiping a guy with blue skin or a goddess with many arms. You are engaging with a concept that is non-dual and beyond all physical description.
And so his trap snaps shut again.
Exactly. He applies the same logic. If the highest truth of Hinduism is something that is beyond form, beyond gender, and strictly inconceivable, then logically and scientifically, God does not exist. The entity that people imagine, the God figure, dissolves into this abstract state of non-duality.
So Hinduism, at its core level, its PhD level, so to speak, joins the no column. It feels like he's showing that the deeper you go into these ancient religions, the more they start to sound like, well, like nothingness.
Empty might be the wrong word, but certainly void of physical characteristics. And that leads perfectly into his next witness, Buddhism.
Now, Buddhism is usually the wild card in these discussions because people argue about whether it's a religion or a philosophy, but the source is pretty straightforward here.
Very straightforward. He says Buddhism allows you to call a spade a spade.
I like that line, call a spade a spade. It felt refreshing after all the neither existence nor non-existence talk.
He notes that Buddha never saw a God concept. There is no creator deity in the traditional sense. The source argues that Buddhism skips the complex theological gymnastics of inconceivable existence and just states clearly it does not exist.
So that's an easy no vote, no ambiguity there.
And he briefly mentions atheists as well, almost as a formality. Obviously, atheists vote no.
Okay, let's look at the scoreboard here. We're in this courtroom of logic. On one side, saying God exists, we have Christianity, and that's based on the historical claim of Jesus. On the other side, saying God does not exist, we have science because of no empirical evidence, Islam because inconceivable implies non-existence, Hinduism because the highest truth is beyond form, Buddhism, which rejects the concept entirely, and atheism.
That is the tally the source presents, and this is where he delivers his verdict. He says, if we are making a decision based on a balance of probabilities and overwhelming evidence, the majority wins.
He throws out a number two. He says it's an 80% margin or more.
Right. He argues that the overwhelming weight of evidence derived from the definitions provided by the religions themselves points to the conclusion that God does not exist.
It's such a provocative way to frame it. Usually, people think of proof against God as proving that religious texts are wrong. But he's saying, no, read the texts properly, read the highest philosophy. They're telling you, quite literally, that this thing does not exist in any way you can understand or measure.
It is a complete inversion of the typical debate. He's suggesting that the believers and the atheists are actually describing the same thing. They just use different words. The atheist says nothing is there, and the mystic says what is there is inconceivable, formless, and neither existing nor non-existing. The source's argument is, logically, those are two ways of saying the same thing.
That's the part that really sticks with me. Not existing and not non-existing. It sounds like a riddle. But if you take it to a court of law, like he asks, a judge isn't going to accept a riddle.
Exactly. A judge deals in facts, in concrete reality. If a witness says the suspect is inconceivable, he wasn't really there, but he wasn't not there, the judge is going to dismiss the case. That's the source's point. When you strip away the emotion, the reverence, and the tradition, and you just look at the logical proposition, the case for a physical existing God falls apart, even using the religion's own testimony.
It's interesting that he keeps saying, don't get emotional, because for most people, religion is entirely emotional. It's about comfort, connection, community. It's about knowing someone is watching over you, but he's stripping all that away to look at the cold, hard syntax of the belief.
And that's why this is such a unique deep dive. It's an exercise in strict adherence to definitions. He's holding these faiths accountable to their most abstract, high-level descriptions. He's essentially saying, you claim your God is beyond time and space. Fine. Then, by definition, he doesn't exist in time and space.
Which science agrees with.
Precisely. It brings the mystic and the scientist into alignment, leaving the believer, the one who thinks there's a literal guy in the sky, as the one who is mistaken.
Except for the Christian claim, which he leaves as the outlier.
Yes, and that's a crucial caveat he leaves in. He doesn't dismantle the historical claim of Jesus.
Yeah.
He just notes it as the one piece of evidence that stands in opposition to the rest because it claims a physical body.
So what does this all mean for us? We've gone through this court case. The verdict, according to the blind Muslim yogi, is an 80% probability that God does not exist. But is he saying there is nothing? Or just that God is the wrong word?
I think the synthesis here, the big takeaway, is about how we define reality. The source is pushing us to realize that our language fails us at the edges of existence. Whether you call it God or physics or the void, once you get to the absolute foundation of reality, it becomes inconceivable. And to a logical mind, inconceivable looks a lot like nothing.
It's a mental workout, for sure. It forces you to question whether existence is even the right word for what these religions are talking about. Maybe existence is too small a word.
Or maybe existence implies limits, boundaries, form, location. And if the divine is unlimited, it cannot exist in the way a chair or a planet exists.
That is a fascinating place to land. Almost like the source is saying, the only way God can be God is if he doesn't exist.
That is the paradox. If he existed, he would be limited. To be unlimited, he must be beyond existence.
Well, we promised a deep dive, and I think we definitely hit the bottom of the ocean on this one. It's a lot to process. The idea that the highest form of faith might actually look exactly like atheism on paper. That's going to keep me up tonight.
It certainly challenges the binary of believer versus non-believer. It suggests they might be staring at the same abyss, just describing it differently.
Absolutely. So here is a final thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. We've talked about how inconceivable equates to non-existence in this logical framework. But ask yourself this. If the highest forms of religious contemplation define the divine as something that cannot be conceived, described, or located, is there effectively any difference between that and nothingness? Or is the limitation in our logic rather than in the subject itself? Are we just trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon?
That is the question.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next one.